All right, what did we learn last night?
Um, we learned to I guess generate like the seats. Like when you like switching like the movies out, it'll keep like switching out like the seats and stuff, make it like occupy and you know not occupy.
Yeah, really interesting, right? Because we did all of the work actually on Monday night to generate the seats themselves, but then there was a long way to go between generating the seats and then actually having all of the HTML generated for it, right? So similar structure in that we use two for loops to loop over everything, but then that disconnect between, well, we've got this JavaScript here. How do we relay that into our HTML? And then we ran into a really interesting problem at the end of the night where the right answer is actually indexes. So good for you guys for getting that. But we ran into this problem of, well, we generate out all of these different seats and we have all of this HTML going on, but then how do we actually connect that back into our JavaScript to know what seat is being clicked on? So we are on the right track, right? We've got this momentum going to make that seat showing up as occupied. But some interesting loops going on back and forth between our JavaScript and our HTML to connect everything. What else from last night? Did we have any light bulb moments? Did we have any moments that we wanted to go over something? Did we review the commented code and maybe come up with something we wanted to review?
I got something.
Yeah.
Can you just go through specifically the row dot push uh, object where it's creating the key of occupied and math dot random, exactly what's happening there, like how it's assigning that key to speed.
Yeah. So basically, we've got a very complex data structure that we're working with here, right? And so what we have done here is really set up a couple layers of things, right? So all the way up the top, we have this empty array of seats. And obviously, this alone does not represent an 8 by 8 grid of seats. But when we dive into what we're doing in the for loop, we kind of build out the data structure as we're going, right? So when we dive into the for loop, we first go through and we loop over um all of the movies, right? So we say, hey, no matter how many movies are in our object is the key is all of the title of the movies, go loop through all of those. Then for each one of them, loop through them and generate out a for loop that will run 8 different times. That outer for loop, well, kind of 3 levels of for loop. So the middle level of the for loop is saying run 8 different times, and each time that you run, start out with an empty array, right? And so that array is the same thing that our empty array out here is accomplishing. It's just giving us a list of all of the data that we want to store. So this seat is our outermost array, and then this row in here is kind of our middle array. Give me 1 second.
So row, just to be clear,
Yeah,
row isn't replacing the seat array, it's going inside the seat array.
going inside the seats array. And we know that because we're going into the seats array and then pushing in it that row array down here.
Gotcha.
So you are totally right. It is going inside of that seats array. So when we think about a multi-dimensional array, it's an array inside of an array, and that's exactly what we're accomplishing here. This is the array that will go inside of the seats array. So then what goes inside the row array? Well, each seat is going to be represented by an object. Why is it an object and not just like true false? Well, there's multiple pieces of information that we want to keep track of about that seat, and we want to keep track of that information by accessing specific keys about that seat, like occupied. So right now, we could have totally have done that as a true false. Is it occupied? Is it not occupied? We didn't even need the object. But what we're building out tonight is keeping track of not only, hey, is that seat occupied or not? We also want to keep track of the fact of, hey, is that seat selected or not, right? Because we're going to select the seats before we buy them as kind of our particular seats, right? And so that's why we kind of thought in advance and said, hey, we need a multi-dimensional array because we're not keeping track of necessarily just all of the rows. We're also keeping track of all of the columns. And each one of those columns is going to be an object. And that object is going to keep track of, hey, is the seat occupied or not? Or is the seat selected or not? Then this line of code is kind of doing some heavy lifting because it's not only creating the object and pushing it into the row of all of the seats that we're building out up here between the two for loops, it's also doing some work to say, come up with a random number. And if that random number is less than 0.5, which there's a 50% chance that it will be, then set occupied to true if it is under 0.5. If it is over 0.5, it will be false. It will be over 0.5. And so that occupied will get set to false. So there's a lot going on in this line of code that we can actually break out into 3 different parts. So don't follow me here, but we could say something like let random num equal math dot random. Then we can say let seat occupied. Then we could say if random number is less than 0.5, seat occupied equals true. Else seat occupied equals false. Oops. Then we could say let seat equal a new object. Then we could say seat dot occupied equals seat occupied. Then we could row dot push our seat. So that is definitely a more verbose way of doing it, but that everything that we did right here is accomplishing the exact same thing of everything we did in this one line of code. And that's kind of the magic of JavaScript, right? Is that there are 9 billion different ways of accomplishing the exact same thing, but we can break that out and say, hey, math.random is going to evaluate out to a value. We happen to store that value in random number. And actually, we can do a const here because that random number isn't changing. Then we evaluate that out to something. We say, hey, is this less than 0.5? If it is, it will be true. Otherwise, it will be false. What are we doing? We're storing all of that in an object. So we can make that empty object and then set a particular property of that object equal to it, or we could make that new object all in one go. Finally, what do we do with that object? We take that whole object and push it to the end of the row that we are generating from up here. So I'm going to add a note in here. We can generate the seat object using the code above, or simplify it to one line of code using the line below. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and then just a follow-up question. Can you explain how the occupied class is working?
The occupied class is what?
how the occupied class is working with the class, right?
Yeah. The class up here is right here. So we say class equals, but the important thing to note here is all of this is in a template literal, right? So we are combining two different concepts here. We're combining a template literal with a ternary operator. And those like keywords, those terms are really important to know, right? So the template literal is what allows us to do this $ curly brace. That $ curly brace is saying, I don't want a string anymore. I want you to execute the JavaScript between these curly braces, and whatever the JavaScript returns, whatever the JavaScript outputs, is what I want you to dump into the string. So what we do here, $curly brace template literal concept, but then this question mark colon syntax is what we call the ternary operator. The ternary operator I think of as an inline if statement, right? We say if the col is occupied. Well, where is col occupied coming from? That's actually coming from our for loop. So when we say the call, that's coming from the object.entries, that's getting us access to the data as we're iterating over it from the for loop. And we're looking at the occupied property. Where's this occupied property coming from? It's coming from the occupied that we set down here. So now it's saying, is this seat occupied? Well, we went through the work to say if it is occupied, it will be true. If it is not occupied, it will be false. So if the seat is occupied, add the class occupied. Well, this is going to output occupied, so this whole $curly brace gets replaced with the word occupied in it. If it is not occupied, just put out an empty string. We don't actually care about it. We don't want to add anything else to the class list. Actually, just don't add anything to the class list. The two concepts to combine there, the template literal and the ternary operator.
Okay, I didn't realize that the row dot push occupied math random was like that initial, like I guess I don't really know the correct term for it, but initializing that key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're not only in kind of the simplified version here, we're not only initializing the key, we're also initializing or setting the value and creating the object itself. But that object is getting pushed into the row. That row ultimately, with all the other 8 seats, gets pushed into the seats array. That seats array is going to keep track of all 8 rows of seats. And eventually that all gets stored in our seats up here. Well, then once we do all of that work, we get all of that data stored, which we can see when we console log out movies, right? We can click into the movie itself. We can click into the rows. We can see the column of all the seats, and we can even click into the column of the seats and see all of the objects that we're setting. But then we have to break that all apart again. We do all of these for loops to generate the data. We also have to do all of these for loops to also set up all of the HTML. And so we do all of those again on change, right? We say, hey, when the movie gets selected, go find the particular movie that got selected, then loop over all of the rows. And once we've looped over all of the rows, then go loop over all of the columns, go loop over each individual seat. Well, now that we're down at that seat level, which is each individual object, we're able to access things like occupied. Because that was all the way down at the object level, we're also able to access that when we got down into the object itself. So we go kind of down all of those levels in the for loop to generate all of the seats in the data structure. And then when a movie is selected, we have to dive down to that same number of levels in the arrays of objects to access that same level. Other questions? Hopefully you guys have had a chance to read through all of the comments. We left off at number 10 last night. And then we picked up and everything that we accomplished yesterday was 11 all the way through looks like 31.
I was gonna ask a question about the ternary operator, the question mark, but you answered it in your response to Joe.
Awesome.
So that's cool.
And I'll do one quick example of that because this is really the first time that we've played around with ternary operator. Again, don't follow me, no live share link, just in yesterday's code. We can say like let my bool equal true. And then we can say const my string equals. And this is where we can say if my bool equals true, then my string is going to equal dog. Otherwise, it's going to equal cat. And if we console log out my string, and I cannot type tonight, apparently, go live and take a look at the console, we can see this is equal to dog. Well, why is that equal to dog? Because my bool was true right here, so it is going to set it equal to dog. If I change my bool to false, it will set it equal to cat. In other words, the longer way of writing this is saying if my bool equals true, my string is going to equal dog, else my string is going to equal cat. And if we comment those out, we can see dog come out. And if we set this to false, we get cat to come out. So this is just a syntax, right? That's allowing us to basically do that inline if statement. It's saying, hey, if whatever is true on the left side of this, then grab this value. If whatever is on the left side of this is not true, grab whatever is on the right of that colon. And in JavaScript, there's a shortcut, there's a shorthand that we can use. Basically, if whenever we're in an if statement or a ternary operator, if what we're checking for is true, we can actually omit this triple equal sign. So if you ever see something that says if whatever is in this, and it doesn't triple equals or double equals true, it actually assumes that what you're looking for is true itself. So if we save that, my bool, because it's false, we still get cat. And then if we comment this out and comment this back in and take out this triple equals true, it just assumes that what we're looking for in that ternary operator is a truthy value. And because of that, we still get cat coming out. So that triple equals true, if we're looking for true itself, is not necessarily a required part of the if statement. That's a little shorthand that saves us to say, hey, in if statements, we're usually looking for true, so we don't need to explicitly triple equals are true. What I don't know off the top of my head is when you omit the double or triple equals, if it does a double equal check or a triple equal check, but you get the idea. We're checking for a truthy value if we don't explicitly ask it. Okay, any other questions from last night's code?
Is the less than sign in the math.random less than 0.5, is that acting as a tertiary operator then?
It is acting as a truthy operator. I don't know if it's acting as a tertiary operator.
But it's basically only assigning the property of occupied if it's under that value.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so the ultimate result of the math.random here, right here, that whole thing evaluates out only to true or false. And then the random number disappears, and there's no way for us to access what that actual random number is, right? So if we look at our seats, we see occupied, true, 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 false, true, false, true, right? So that random number, once it's generated, it doesn't really matter because it's checking to see if it's above 0.5 or below it. And then whether if it's below it, it's true. And so that is what we actually save. So that is kind of like an if operator, but we're taking whatever the result of that if operator is, true or false, and storing that directly inside occupied. So you can kind of see that like explicitly written out here, compared to down here where we're just taking the result of that truthy statement and storing that. Any other question?
There's one in the chat.
Oh, I really hate that there's no option in Zoom to like play a sound effect when there's a message in chat. And like when I'm screen sharing, there's no chat bubble that shows me that there's a message. So thank you for calling that out, and please continue to do that. Can I please explain on-click data row index, data col index? Absolutely. Very good question. Okay, so this started really basic and got really complex as we were writing this code, right? So we started with just this span that had the chair on it, and that was it, right? I think it also had the material symbols outlined. Then we added in kind of 3 additional layers of complexity. The first thing that we added was the ternary operator, which was saying, hey, if the seat is occupied based off of the math.random when we generated out the seat, add a conditional class, add occupied if it is, otherwise don't add anything. Then we added on a second layer. We said, hey, on click, when you click on the seat, fire off the seat clicked function and provide the details of the event. Well, what did that do? That made it so that when we clicked on the seat, it came all the way down to the seat clicked function and ran all of the code down here. The problem that we ran into is we need to know exactly what seat was clicked on. And ideally, we need to know what seat was clicked on based off of the row and the column index of that seat. Well, there are ways of achieving that using just the child information. Basically, how nested are you into this? So if you think about the CSS, we use nth child, but that kind of gets a little complicated, right? Because we need to get into the parent element and then figure how many indexes down are we. Gets a little complex. So instead, we kind of sidestep that. And we said, hey, up here in this for loop, when we're looping over all of the columns and we're looping over all of the rows, we can actually pretty easily get access to that index with our object.entries. So we threw our row and our movie data.seats into our object.entries, and that gave us access to the row index and the column index. We then used those pieces of information to store that in a special attribute called data dash, and then we can name it whatever we want. So data dash is in the HTML standard to basically say, hey, the HTML isn't going to care about this, but it knows it is some piece of information that the developer would like to store about this particular HTML element that we can then pull out down the road. So because we have very easy access to the elements right here, and not just the elements, but the particular indexes, while we're looping over all of them, pull the index out in our JavaScript land and just store them in our HTML element here. Then forget about them until this on-click event fires right here. When that on-click fires, we're going to get access to the event almost always will have a target, which we use right here, and we want to get out an attribute. What attribute do we want to get out? We want to get the row index and the column index that we so happen to fortunately store right here. Then, once we're able to get out the row and the column index, we are able to use those to dig into the onion of our data, peel back all of the individual layers of that onion, go to our selected movie, which is coming from our movie selection dropdown, pull the value out from that, go into the seats. Why are we going into the seats? Because each one of the movies has a seats value, a seats key in the object. And then once we get into the value of those seats, use the row index and the col index that we are extracting out um, from our attributes that we stored in the for loop that got stored into the HTML element. Did that answer your question? We haven't like used that data yet. All we did is like got back to that layer of the data. So now that we're there, what we're going to do tonight is set the seat as occupied. And then we got to go update our HTML to basically show that that seat is occupied again. So tonight we are making our way in our journey of experienced developers. Tonight's going to be the first time that we actually refactor some of our code to say, well, we could just copy and paste this entire section of code, but there's a way that we can actually reuse that code. And so we're going to get into a little bit of refactoring tonight. Any other questions about yesterday's code?
Joe left a comment on the chat. I don't know if you answered it or not.
Oh, yes. Does data dash allow all data types? I am pretty sure. Let's confirm this. If we log out row index, I am pretty sure that that is going to come out as a string. Kind of hard to tell, right? It just has the number 1 there. So if we use a keyword of type of, that's one of those keywords that's built into JavaScript, and try that again and pick on something, you'll see that it comes back as a string. So the JavaScript is smart enough that if we pass a string index to an array, it is smart enough to automatically parse that string as a number for us. So the HTML standard does store all attribute values as strings, but then when we access a particular index of an array, if it happens to be a string, it will automatically parse it for us. So good question. JavaScript is just doing a little bit of magic because it knows we're accessing an array. Kind of the same thing of, well, why don't we need to put Rugrats into quotes here? It knows that all objects are using strings as the key. So it will automatically like do that data conversion for us, so to speak. The same thing goes down here, although down the road, as we're working with strings that happen to hold numbers, we will need to get into parsing them or converting the data type, basically. No, Anwar, we've just been reviewing so far, no new code. Any other questions from yesterday's code? Super important that we have we get understanding of what we've done so far, right? Because if we don't get what we've done so far, we are going to be on a really unsolid foundation of what we build on top of it. So I know it's kind of boring to go through 30 minutes of code review, but getting our brain back into it, kind of rereading through all of the numbers, making sure that we've got a solid foundation of understanding of what we've built, I think is a very worthwhile step of what we've built so far. Anything else? Going once. Going twice. Sold. Moving on to new code. So, I'm going to close out of everything. I'm going to head to my week 8 day 2 folder. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that. I will rename that as day 3. I'm going to pop open my VS Code for my day 3. I will start a live share and paste that into the chat. I will go live. Also going to pull up my reference site and paste that in the chat. Don't get lost between your live share, my live share or live server, and the final version, which I do all the time, of course. Guys, a minute to connect. Okay. So where did we leave off? Well, we've done a lot of work. We made it so that when we click on a movie, not only do we generate out all of the JavaScript to keep track of all of the rows, all of the columns, and all of the objects that represent the seat, we also then kind of do that again. We make it so when the movie is changed, we go back through the rows, we go back through the columns, and this time, instead of generating out all of the objects which are storing the data, instead we generate out a span tag. That span tag is storing not only the classes based off of the data, it is also giving us access to the row index and column index so that when we click on that movie, we are able to pull that information back out, reach into our JavaScript, and get the individual seat that we are dealing with in the object of the movies that has an array of the seats, that has another array representing all of the rows, that has another array that is all of the columns, that is representing each object which is storing the data about that particular seat. So you're saying, my God, this seems like we're going back and forth between JavaScript and HTML and JavaScript and HTML and JavaScript a lot. Yes, that's what this whole point, the point of this project is meant to do, right? When we get into React, we'll see that there's actually a simpler way to kind of interface with all of this data. The beauty of React is that it is meant to build web apps more than it is meant to build websites. So what we're seeing in this JavaScript a lot, right, is that oftentimes the HTML that we're trying to represent is based off of some data, whether that is weather data that we need to update based off of what location is selected, whether that is movie seats data that we can easily store as arrays and objects, but then we need to do all kinds of these loops to get it to show as our HTML. Well, when we get into React, the beauty of that is that we don't actually need to update all of this HTML. We can just update the data. And because our HTML and JavaScript are so intermeshed, when we update that data in this new concept that we'll learn about in a couple weeks called state, the state is smart enough to go, whoa, the state just got updated, the JavaScript data just got updated, go regenerate that HTML based off of the data that changed in the JavaScript. However, a couple weeks away from React. So we've got to learn how to do that kind of manually. We've done all of this work to get access to the seat itself. Now, we would like to store that this seat, and this is where you can start following along with me, is going to be selected. So we set our seat selected equal to true. Then we are going to log out our seat. So I save that, I come over, I go to the Godfather, I pick on my first seat, and it looks like nothing happened. But if I go into my console, I am able to see my seat is now selected true. There are 2 steps that it will take to make this seat actually appear as if it were selected. Does anyone want to take a guess at what one of them may be?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
repeat that, please.
So there are 2 steps it will take to make this seat appear that it is selected. Does anyone want to take a stab at what one of the 2 may be?
First step is to see if that seat in that area is occupied. Then possibly then it would then show the available seating if running through the code to see if that seat was occupied or not. Sorry, I'm jumping around.
We will need to do that, but that isn't going to show whether or not this seat is selected. So yes, you are right. Hold that thought.
Well, we're gonna.
No, go ahead.
I said, well, I know we're gonna change the color to blue. So would we create some sort of like if statement or if
How did
loop?
we? Where else have we done that?
All right, let me look.
You are right. You're totally right.
Oh, is it the occupied seat? The
It sure
ternary?
is. So
Look at
what
that.
we want to do is we want to add in another conditional here. We want to say, hey, if this seat is selected, then add a class called selected. Otherwise, don't worry about it.
Screen.
Yes, I am.
Are you? I can't see it.
Can other people see my screen?
Yes.
You got to click the
Screen
square
time.
at the top of your Zoom. To say, I mean, a rectangle, and it says hack upstate screen, and next to it says meeting.
Oh my God.
I think that's new though.
I'm
I
not
think
the
that was
only
like,
one who is screwed over by
I think
this.
that came out like
update.
4 days ago, literally, because people at my
is
job were complaining about that.
God, I'm not alone. They moved the recording button too, so I can't pause the recording anymore from the bottom. I got to go all the way back up to the top right, and they just move things around on me, driving me nuts. So that is a good tip. Okay, so we do need to add this col selected. Because this is a class, we also need to think about adding that class in. So let's do that before we forget. I'm going to head to my style.css. I will add a selected class with a color of blue. I save that. I come back over here. I now click on a movie. I click on a seat, and I still get my selected as true. And I'm like, well, I go into my inspect and I look at that particular seat, and I do have my material symbols outlined, right? So my icons know how to work. And I can see that my occupied is getting applied to some seats, but I definitely clicked on this seat. And if I click on it again, it doesn't change. Why not? This is number 2.
Do
You
we gotta
have to.
connect the JavaScript to CSS somehow? My bad.
I kind of already
No,
did that though, right? Because I put
Oh.
this col selected in here, and my style sheet has the selected just like it has the occupied.
We
So it
need
is kind of connected.
Yeah, I was gonna say we need like another style in the style sheet for when it's not selected. So since we got occupied and selected, we will need to have a third thing for when I guess the user is not clicking on the seat.
Nope,
No?
because by default it will default to a color of black, right? And so
Uh
that's what it's doing. It's saying, oh, I know what material symbols outlined is. I know how to make the chair display. And because it is not occupied or selected, it will just show up as basically a space in the class list, which doesn't affect anything. So that's not the problem. Any other guesses as to why this is not setting? When does our for loop
Oh, because
run
you need to
here?
click it again.
What? Just click it again? I'll just keep clicking it.
Hit the refresh button.
That, by the way, just keep clicking it and see if it works is the thing that drives me nuts when I'm sitting next to my mom and it doesn't work the first 3 times. And so what she do, she just keeps on clicking on it. Like, that's not how this works. I build these things. Stop it.
Unless somebody says only run after you click it 73 times.
So that is, we're kind of on the right track there. We're doing all of this work right here, right? If the column is selected or not selected. But we know something. All of this is in a for loop. Okay, for loops aren't the problem. But where is this for loop? This for loop is actually on the movie dropdown on change. What do we know about functions? Functions only run when we call them. So if I click on this seat and this seat, then change my movie drop down to some other movie and change it back to Citizen Kane, look what happens. Our seats are actually showing up in blue. What is actually happening there? Well, we're coming down here and properly setting the seat as selected. But the HTML itself does not get updated until the on change event happens. Well, now we run into a problem because the seat getting selected is going all the way up to our movies object, and our movies object all the way up here, now with all of the generated seats, is now showing our seat as selected. But our JavaScript data and our HTML do not automatically update. What we have said is go through all of the work of this for loop and this for loop and figure out whether each seat is selected or not, but only do that when the movie has changed. So what we can do, pause, do not follow me on this, is we could go, well, wait a minute. We're doing all of this work. What happens if we just copy this for loop? Again, please do not follow me on this step. And we go all the way down until this for loop is done. Copy this and say, after we do all of the work to get this seat selected, we can paste in this for loop. So if we save that, come over here and pick our movie. Oh, I was close. Apparently I didn't copy enough. Now when I pick a movie and I pick a seat, it automatically turns blue. Okay. Well, we did all of that work. But now what happens when I'm like, oh, I need to modify this function. I need to make it so, and we will actually do this in a second, when we click on a red seat, it doesn't actually do anything because that seat's already been occupied. Well, now we've got two different places to change that function. That seems problematic, right? And if we needed to update that HTML in yet another place, we would run into that problem again. So what JavaScript concept can we use to abstract this code out into something so that we can ask that code to run in multiple different places?
Make it a separate function.
You can make it a separate function. So I'm going to take all of this code out, and I'm going to make it its own function. And whenever we make it its own function, after we do that, we need to test and make sure the original scenario that we had all of that code is still working. Then we need to make it work in the second scenario. And if we can make it work in both, then we know, okay, this function is safe to use almost anywhere that we want. So the first thing we need to do is make the function itself. So I'm going to go all the way up to our movies object. Normally, when we have what we call a global function, a function that we can access anywhere in our JavaScript, we want to store that towards the top of the page. So I'm going to make a new function called update HTML. And it's going to take no parameters, right? It doesn't need any additional data of how to work, but all we're going to store in it with no parameters, those are the empty curly braces. We're going to say it's a function, so that's the arrow curly braces, and then the curly braces themselves are going to say, hey, this is what runs whenever we ask update HTML to run. Then I'm going to go down and I'm going to analyze what do we want update HTML to do. What we want update HTML to do is start with this on change. We want to figure out, let me think about how I want to do this. Okay, we're going to take this whole thing. We're going to say, hey, when they, sorry, I'm going back and forth of how to do this. We're going to start down here because the HTML starts with generating out from an empty string, right? So we're going to start at number 20, and we're going to copy that all the way down to the document get element by ID seats inner HTML seats equals HTML. So I'm not going to take that closing curly brace, but I'm going to take my seats HTML all the way up at number 20, and I'm going to cut that. Command X to cut it. Then I'm going to come all the way up to my update HTML, and I'm going to paste it. Now, in order for my update HTML to work, I need to tell it, hey, when my movie changes in the dropdown, I still want you to get the selected movie. I still want you to get the movie data. I still want you to log out all of the seats. And then I would like you to update the HTML. What are these parentheses saying? They're saying, no, update HTML is not just a variable that I want you to reference. The parentheses are saying, please go actually run that function now. So I save that, I come over, I change my movie dropdown, and I get an error that says movie data is not defined. And it's telling me, okay, that's on line 32. Well, where is that movie data? That movie data is right here. Now we run into a problem with what we call variable scope. Because this function, now that we've moved it out into its own little function, it cannot access any variables that are declared in another function. Well, this function is called update HTML. And it does not have access to the movie data that we got access to right here. How do we provide access to a variable based off of another function? Does anyone know the answer to that? how do we make a function run a little differently based off of the input it is provided?
The object entries or value thing.
Pass it a parameter.
We pass it a parameter. That's exactly the right answer. So we're going to pass it the movie data right here. Because we are passing it when we call the function, it is called an argument. So this is an argument. An argument is what controls how many times that function, how that function runs. Now, when we declare this function, we need to tell it, hey, heads up, you are going to get a parameter called movie data. So when we call the function, it is an argument. When we declare the function, when we tell the function this is what you're going to do, it becomes a parameter. So we send an argument into a parameter, and now that this parameter is here, we can access this parameter in the entire scope of this function. This function now can use our movie data. So if we save that and come over, we click on Citizen Kane, and now all of our seats should be showing up. I'm going to pause there because that was moving around a lot of code. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to catch up on that. Make sure your drop down is still working. And I'm going to create a quick poll to make sure you guys are caught up. It was only a couple steps, but it was moving a lot of code around. So I want to make sure it is working for everyone. While we are there, reminder, we will have office hours on Saturday at Common Space. They will be at Sunday at 10 a.m. at Common Space. And if you cannot join in person, they will also be on Zoom in this same link. So a reminder of what we did, we moved the let seats HTML all the way down to this document get element by ID, seats HTML. We moved that all into this new function called update HTML. We also told update HTML, hey, you're going to get the movie data sent in as a parameter. What is that movie data? That movie data is representing what is the specific movie that we selected. Then down in our on change, we took all of that HTML, all of that JavaScript that updated the HTML, we threw it up in that function called update HTML, and then we now need to tell, hey, once you have selected the movie based off of the event target value, you've gotten that movie data out, go update the HTML based off of the movie data, which is based off of the movie that we selected. So what should be happening in your browser, basically what was working before, but now that we've moved it into a function, we need to test to make sure that function still works. So we update that there, we go to our dropdown, we pick our movie, and we should still see our seats display. If any of you are having problems, feel free to ask for help. About half of you have voted in the poll. If you have not voted in the poll, go ahead and do so.
Just to be clear, we haven't put anything into seat click yet, right? We're just getting the old stuff to work.
In the seat clicked, we have not modified anything yet there, no.
Okay.
Yeah, all we have done is update HTML here and then moved all of that code in and updated the parameters.
My seats, when I select them, doesn't turn blue.
It will not do that yet because we haven't put it into seat clicked yet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Reminder to vote in the poll if you have not already. or if anyone needs help, feel free to ask for it. I'm just curious, did they move the poll as well? Does the poll now show up as like another tab where the screen share shows up? No? Okay, great. That's always been a problem of once you lose the poll, it's hard to find like where it was. And I'm
Just a
glad they
pop-up
didn't
for
fix
me.
that.
Did I vote on the poll?
I can't tell, but I will count you as yes.
Okay. My mom brain. I don't remember, but I feel like I did for some reason. But it's gone. So
Yeah, the polls in Zoom, it's like, come on, why can't you show me who voted in this?
Yeah.
Like it shows me 13 of 16, but then it's like, why can't you show me usernames of who has voted in that? So annoying. Okay. Anyone need another minute? Anyone need help? All right. Now that we have done the work to move this into its own function, we can now do the next step, which is, oh, well, down here, we need to update the HTML again right here. But the update HTML is expecting the parameter of the movie data. So we need to also get that movie data that we did when we change the movie. The problem here is that when we got the selected movie, we did that from the event target value. What was the event in this case? The event was the change of the dropdown. Well, down here, the event is the seat getting clicked. So we don't actually have access to the selected movie from the event target value of the change. We have access to what the seat was clicked on. But we already solved that. We already got the selected movie from the document get element by ID movie selection. So what we are able to do here is instead of making the update HTML be based off of movie data, instead we can make it be based off of movies. What is movies? That's our giant object all the way up here at the top. And then we have access to the selected movie. This time we don't get access to it through the event. We do get access to it by going back to the HTML document, grabbing the value from our element of movie selection. So we can use that right here and say selected movie. Now, when we select that movie, our seats show up, then our seat clicked fires, and if our seat clicked fires, it shows up as blue. Okay. Does anyone not have their seat showing up as blue? Everything
My
that we
seats
did
are
is
not blue, but I'm gonna
just
debug.
okay. I'll give you a minute.
Yeah.
A reminder, if this is not working for you, make sure your console is open. If your console is not open, the computer may be screaming that it is trying to help you with what line it has an error on, and you can't even see it. So make sure your console is always open whenever we are working on JavaScript code. And again, your seats will not show up as blue unless you click on one of them. Make sure you're not forgetting that step. I definitely feel like I need to keep a logbook of all of the quotes from across 6 different cohorts. I still want a t-shirt that says Jesus take the wheel and it just says request remote control in the Zoom screen sharing menu.
I was
You need to
immediately
update
thinking
permissions.
like I was thinking immediately like with that, it's Jesus sitting with you on the desk and he's just like typing in code. That's what I'm thinking as soon as you said that.
Lots of little steps to make this blue, so no shame in asking for help at this point. All 178 lines of code are necessary to make this happen. Roughly. I mean, obviously the comments aren't, but other than that.
Okay, can you help me? I'm gonna share my screen.
Go for it.
So I looked in my inspector and it's saying it's on line 24. I go to line 24, but I don't see the error.
Okie doke. Okay, so the error is cannot convert undefined or null to object on 24. So we know the problem has to be something with probably our movie data because that's what it's trying to convert. Object.entries, the whole point of it is to convert this object here into an array that we can iterate over. So we want to take a step back. When's the last time that we've updated movie data? It is probably when we tried to set the seat as occupied, right? Or selected, I mean. So we do our movies selected movie, which is coming from our value. We grab the seats and we use the row index and the column index to set it as selected. And then what are we sending into this function? Update HTML, we don't want to send, well, we're sending in movies. Movies is all of the different movies, right? But what is update HTML expecting? Update HTML is expecting the movie data of one movie in particular.
Oh, because we only clicked one movie in particular.
Correct.
So I should put movie data?
Yeah, exactly. Because when we
Oh.
call update HTML right here, you can
Oh, yeah,
see
yeah.
movie data is based off of the selected movie. So we want to do the exact same thing down here. And now, oh, I want to see the Cheetah Girls. Can we do that
I
after
know,
class
right?
tonight?
Me too. Yay, we going to sit there.
Good to
Thank
go.
you.
It definitely is a different part of the brain, right? So like when you think about based off of Joe's comment in the chat. So it is, I realize that when you guys watch this back on YouTube, you don't have access to the chat, and then you're like, what in God's name is he talking about? So debugging is a very different thing than writing code, right? So it's kind of like when you're writing an essay, when you're writing a book, when you're writing any kind of literature, right? And then you send it to an editor, and the editor goes through and they go, dumbass, you spelled this wrong, this word wrong. Well, of course, when you're reading the book, you go, oh, that's not spelled right. But when you're writing the book, if you don't have those red squigglies on, right, you have no idea that you mistyped that, or like you know how to spell that word, but your brain is just outputting things and you don't catch that as you're going, right? So the same goes for debugging, because when you're writing the code, the way I like to think about this is you're going from an English sentence into JavaScript syntax, right? So you're saying, this is what I want you to do. I would like you to update the HTML based off of the movie's object that we are selecting out the selected movie of. But when we're debugging, we're going not from front to back, but back to front. We're going, this thing happens, then this thing happens, then this thing happens, right? And so because you're almost working in reverse, you're not thinking about how the English is going to translate into JavaScript syntax. Instead, you're thinking about this as, what order is the computer running this? right? Because update HTML, even though we put it all the way up at the top of our file, does not mean that the computer is going to run it in that order. And so that's why all of the numbers that we write out are actually really helpful in the comments, because we're not writing them in the order that we wrote the code. We're writing them in the order that the computer is executing the code. And 9 times out of 10, not always, there's definitely a 10% exception to that, but oftentimes when we're debugging, we're not thinking about it in the order that we wrote it. We're thinking about it in the order that it's executing. And I think that's the different part of the brain that kind of turns on and goes, this is now logic thinking. This isn't how do I make a thought show up as syntax. Okay, anyone else need help? Anyone else not click on a seat and make it turn blue?
I'm still trying to debug mine.
No shame in asking for help. I will buy you 2 more minutes by saying go take attendance. The code word tonight is blue seat. It's just blue. Let's just make it blue. Last night was seat. I'm not getting creative with my secret words, apparently. Tonight, the secret word is blue.
Next, are we gonna like be able to unselect the seats and make them not blue?
We have 3 more things that we need to accomplish. One will be unselecting seats. A second will be keeping track of the number of seats that we have selected. And the third will be checking out to make our selected seats show up as occupied. And if we have time left after that, after all the commenting, you can ask me to do whatever you would like in this movie app, and I will find a way to make it happen.
Actually put a GIF in the spot that says screen of the movie you chose. If it
I was going
exists on the
to
internet.
integrate AI to be able to solve all of our coding woes, but you know, a GIF works for me as well.
I was a simple girl.
I don't think you can send a GIF in Zoom chat, but I think if you like download the GIF and send it as a file, it will show up in the chat. Don't quote me on that though.
I used to be able to when I last year I worked in National Grid, and we were in a month-long class, and we would just send GIFs all day about how boring it was. I needed to send a GIF and saying that my brain hurted, but I can't find it.
Maybe it's like a Zoom extension that you have to install for like the entire workplace to make it work. I don't know. I
Probably.
certainly haven't turned that off, but maybe it's something that I need to turn on.
My Zoom also updated.
Maybe they took it out in the new update. That could be.
Yeah, I gotta write corporate or something. This is ridiculous.
All right, Terry, you want help before we move on? Go ahead, share your screen. All right, show us what's happening.
Okay, hang on. Just if this will move. Hello.
Hello.
Trying to get oh, there we go. Finally.
All right, let me request remote. All right, so we've got our seat clicked all the way down at the bottom. It is updating HTML based off of the selected movie. Selected movie is defined up here. going into our movies array and sending all of that to update HTML. Update HTML is getting the HTML, doing all of the work, and then finally setting all of that in. So I don't see anything wrong jumping out at me immediately. So let's see if the console is going to help us out. So I'm going to pick a movie. All the seats show up. I'm going to pick a seat. It still does not turn blue, but it does log everything out. And to prove that, if we clear that and click on a seat, you see all the seats appear back up. That's because the HTML, update HTML function is working. So that to me says, all right, let's go back to the on click. And on the on click, nope, not the on change. The on click, seat clicked, do the work to set the selected seat to true. So we need to go look in our update HTML. Our update HTML is saying if the call is selected at a class of selected, okay. And then in our style.css,
Oh, right, I forgot to put the class selected. And
well,
then-
it would help if I could spell it right too. My God, cannot type tonight. Okay, now we have our blue seats, and if we click on more seats, they now turn blue. Everything except the last step. You were so close.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we've got one more problem. Well, we got 3 more things that we need to accomplish. When I'm in here and I pick a seat that is already occupied, it's like, okay, I'll let you steal that person's seat. How can we make that not happen? What JavaScript concept do we want to use and where do we want to use it? So this is where I'm going to stop giving you answers and make you start thinking, okay, what JavaScript concept do we need to use to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Conditional, right?
A conditional, which is also known as a
If
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 statement.
statement. Yep.
If else statement. Or
Yep, same thing. They call them conditionals. I always think of them as if statements because that's what you actually type. So I don't know. That's just like a thing when they teach JavaScript. I'm like, just call it an if statement. Why do you gotta call it a conditional? So where do we need to put that if statement?
and the C click, so you
We
can
sure
check and
do,
see.
right?
Yeah.
Because that's where we're saying, well, if they click on the seat, what do we want to base the condition off of?
Occupy, right?
If it is occupied, right? So we still need to do all of this logic to see what the selected movie is, to get the row and the col out of it. And we even need to do the logic to see what seat they selected. But before we set it as selected, what we need to do is say if the seat is what? If the seat is occupied. And if it is, we can throw an alert that says already taken. Else, what do we want to do? We still want to set it selected, we want to log the seed out, and we want to update the HTML. So we save that. Be careful on your curly braces here, right? Because we only want to set the seat as selected if the seat is not occupied. And what did we see here? This is a little shorthand, right? So what we're basically saying here is if the seat occupied is equal to true, but whenever we check for a true condition, we don't need to explicitly say triple equals true because it will already check for that Boolean value. So that's just an additional thing that we don't need, but that's what we're saying. If the seat occupied is equal to true, then alert this out, else go do this thing. Joe, you have a question. If it's aren't there other conditionals other than an if statement? You could argue that like the second condition of a for loop is a conditional that says, does this statement run if this thing is still true? You could also say that a ternary operator is also another conditional, right? That's saying if the first part of this ternary operator is true, use this value, otherwise use the other one. A double and is a chaining operator. It's not necessarily a conditional, although you get into short-circuiting logic where you say if this or this, and if the first one is true, you use that value. That could technically be a conditional, but I would say that if you said to 100 different developers, name a conditional in your programming language, 90, or if you said it to 100, 99 of them are going to say, oh, an if statement is a conditional. So like, yeah, I guess there are technically other places you can use a logic operator that will lead to a conditional statement running, but it's an if statement, so just call it an if statement kind of thing. Okay, we save this, we come over here, we pick our movie, we pick a seat that is not occupied and it turns blue, we pick another one, it turns blue, we click on a red one and it tells us that it is already taken, we can hit OK, and that seat still stays red. One little nitpick that is driving me crazy, when we hover over a seat, it shows up as a cursor. How am I, in God's name, to know as an end user that I can click on that seat? We need to change that. So I'm going to head to my style.css. I am going to, within my, I'm going to target my seats. I'm going to target any span that is inside my seats. And I am going to change the cursor to a pointer, so we know we can click on it. We could even get fancy and say in our seats, go target a span that also has a class of occupied and make that cursor a not allowed. Never actually done this in this project, so let's see if it works. I come over, I hover over a seat, it gives me the little cursor. I hover over a seat that is taken, and now I get a little no, do not enter sign. And if I click on it, I still get my already taken message. Okay, this is a good time for break. Go on break, be back at 7:20, and we will dive in to getting our counter working to keep track of how many seats have been selected.
Hey Max, I got a question before you go.
Shoot. Yeah.
What was what the attendance was blue seats?
Or just the word blue, either is fine.
Okay. And the second part, why in the heck did I figure that out? Like with the conditionals and stuff. I'm trying to figure it's like I'm able to like figure it out when we're in class, but when it comes to doing it on my own, I'm like, what the heck did I just learn? Like I don't know if I'm the only one that thinks like that, but it's like, what in the hell? I don't know.
Yeah, so ask that question after break, because I think it's worthwhile for all the students to hear the answer to that. Because I do have an answer for you, but it's good for everyone to hear that.
Okay.
What time?
7:20.
Okay.
So I think Terry asked a really good question before the break, so give you guys a minute to jump back on.
What is a switch statement?
Good question. Switch statement is another way to write a if statement based off of the same variable. So a switch statement, this was not Terry's question, this is a tangent. I never write switch statements because I think if statements are easier to understand and they're definitely more powerful. But basically what you can say is like, let my var equal 3. And then you can say switch based off of my var.
You're not sharing your screen. I think I'm
Thank you.
There we go. So,
And then you can say if my var is 1, then console log first. If it is 2, console log second. And then the default case is console log not first or second. And if you look at that, it won't do exactly what you expect. So if we refresh and are on the right tab, you see not first or second. So that's probably what you would expect, right? It's not this one, it's not this one, so go do this one. Kind of an if-else statement. But if we change it to 2, you may be surprised to see. Oh, I thought that would. Thought you had to do break statements. 2 second 1. Okay, yeah. So in this case, it says first and second. And you're like, why is it doing that when the variable is 1? Because switch statements require that you put a break at the end of it to prevent it from continuing to evaluate other cases. And so by the time that you put the breaks into each one of these, you are already at the exact same number of lines of code it would take to write this as an if statement. So the benefit of a switch statement is that if you're always checking the same variable, you don't need to write if my var equals 1, else if my var equals 2, else if my var equals 3, else, right? You're able to basically write my var once and then make the conditions be based off of just the cases of that. But this is literally the exact number of lines of code it would take to write an if statement. It's actually one fewer than it. So at that point, why wouldn't you just write the freaking if statement? Because then if you need to check if this thing is true and this other thing is also true, you're able to do that. You're able to do like a double ampersand compared to this, which you're only allowed to write that switch statement based off of one particular variable. So when I was looking up conditional statements, if statements obviously are what came up. Switch statements are the ones that I forgot about. Ternary operators I remembered. And then any kind of like double ampersand isn't technically a conditional. It is more of a logical operator that you use in a conditional statement.
so is a switch statement just like an antiquated?
People still use them. I don't like them, but people still use them. Switch statements and if statements came out around the same time. I think it was, I mean, they date all the way back to the beginning of JavaScript. So I imagine at the exact same time. I think it's more that older languages had switch statements and developers were used to writing switch statements. So the creator of JavaScript also included them as a alternative conditional type, right? Just like there were older programming languages that supported like while loops but didn't support for loops. And then they were like, oh, well, for loops make a lot of sense. For a long time, JavaScript didn't support ternary operators. Or template literals. Those are newer things that came out in ES6, which I believe was 2015, because they were something that the syntax kind of just like made sense, right, in other programming languages. And they were like, well, why can't we do this in JavaScript, right? We don't use backticks for anything. So we might as well support template literals. Just like for a long time, for of loops weren't supported in JavaScript, and they finally added them, or .filter and .map are ES 2015 features. So, just we see other programming languages, we see what they do well, and then we're like, oh, well, that syntax just makes sense. JavaScript should support that as well. Okay. Terry had a really good question after right before the break, or right after I announced the break. That was like, why can I answer questions when you ask them in class, but then when I go to write my own code, I'm like, I don't know what to do. I know no JavaScript, right? And I think the answer to that is because what I have done for each one of these projects is, obviously, not only have I been teaching these projects almost every single cohort, but I write these out before class, right? Like, I do this entire project, I have reference code. I actually haven't used it tonight, but usually up on this monitor, whenever you see me looking over up to the left, I'm actually looking at the code that's already been written, right? So that's why it goes so smoothly in class. That's one reason. The other reason is it's because when I'm asking these questions, I'm asking these questions in a way that have a single answer. And so, what is engineering? Engineering of any type: architectural engineering, structural engineering, chemical engineering. I don't know, all the different types of engineering out there, right? The main part of engineering, and I don't know if this is actually a textbook definition, but this is how I think about engineering, is breaking down a complex problem into small enough parts that we can solve. So when I ask a question in class, I'm not asking you to go write 10 lines of code. I'm asking you a question that is small enough, that is broken down into a simple enough part that there is a single answer. That is not the case when you go to write code, right? When you go to write code, you look at this whole movie project and you're like, I got to get the seats to show up. I got to generate the seats. I got to make the drop down show up. I got to be able to click, right? Like, they're all of these different things. And you're like, where do I even start on that? Well, in class, I'm giving you every single step. And all I'm asking is, what is this very next step? Because I've broken it down small enough. So when you're writing your own code and you're getting overwhelmed, that's when you go, I'm an engineer, right? Yes, we say full stack web developers, developers and engineers are very similar terms. I don't think they mean the exact same thing. I can't remember if I've given you my spiel on developer versus engineer, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. So when you're looking at this and you're like, I wouldn't even know where to get started on this project, that's when you go, that's not a code problem. It isn't that I don't know JavaScript. It isn't that I don't know the syntax. It's that I got to think like an engineer. I got to break this down to a small enough piece. And oftentimes what we want to do with that is think about, I need to write a sentence. I need to write an objective here. And the objective, if the objective is, I want to build a movie theater app, then you go, wrong. What do I need to do? I need to make this H1 show up. Wait, I can write that in a line of code. Check. That's a good sentence to write. Okay, what do I need to do next? I need to make the dropdown show up. Okay, great. That's something we can say in a sentence. That's something when we go drop down, that's HTML, that's select, that's options. Great. I need to make that show up, right? And so the answer to why am I freezing up when I'm writing my own code, but when you ask a question in class, I can answer it, it's because I've engineered that down to a small enough piece that the answer is just a word or it is just a sentence, right? And so that's a really helpful thing for you to do as well. This movie app, even though we've done 30 some numbers of commented out code, the objectives that we did to get that code to work are actually pretty similar. So if you're freezing up at that point, the right answer may be, hey, whether it's comments in my code, whether it's getting out a notebook, whether it's going to Trello, whether it's opening the reminders app on the Mac, whether it's opening up a note or a sticky, like whatever it is, all I'm going to do is start breaking down what features I need or what I need to show up on this page. Because once you're able to break that down, if you're looking at that and going, I still don't know how to do that. I don't know what HTML concept I need or what CSS concept I need or what JavaScript concept I need. That's when you can go, all right, let me do sub bullets on that. Let me mind map that. Let me draw lines off of that and think about the smaller pieces that it's going to take to make that happen. right? Because when we say, hey, when the select changes, all of the seats need to show up, that in theory sounds like an easy enough statement, but then we got to break that down to I have to generate the seats. I need to loop over all of the seats that are generated. I need to update the HTML, or I need to generate the HTML, and then I need to set the HTML into the JavaScript. Well, now all of a sudden we took that one sentence, broke it down into 5 tasks, and you now know how to do those 5 tasks. So the kind of I don't want to say infuriating, but slightly angering answer here is that JavaScript is really only like 15 concepts in general, right? Loops, document object model, variables and data types, functions, scope, document object model. I can't remember if I said that. Right, like there's a very small list of these 10 or 15 concepts in JavaScript that really encapsulate everything that we're learning. But when you can pair those concepts up with a small enough sentence and go, well, how do I need to generate the seats? Well, I need 2 things. I need to store those seats somewhere. So that's data structures and variables. And then I also need to be able to loop over them to generate a certain number of seats. Well, now you go, all right, well, that's a for loop. All of a sudden, the entire function of generating out those seats becomes much easier. And practice, 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 right? That's the other answer of like, well, the more you see a for loop, the more you go, oh, well, I need this to happen 64 times. I'm not going to write out 64 lines of code. I'll use a for loop for that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Joe, I read your comment, and I still will use if statements over switch statements until the day I die.
It seems like a very narrow use case. One use it over the other.
There is and this is good for everyone to hear, because sometimes they ask it on technical interviews. There is something called big O notation, and it's I think it's the Greek symbol for like the O with the line through it. I think, don't quote me on that. But the whole thing with big O notation is like when you write nested loops, there is a mathematical way of basically stating the efficiency of the code that you're writing. And that's when you can argue about like, oh, recursion's faster than a for loop, or like, oh, if we write this sorting algorithm in a different manner, it may be more efficient than a different sorting algorithm. So sorting gets into like, do we split the array in half and then in half again, and then only compare this number to another number? Or instead, do we sort the entire thing one time through and then look at the second index and sort it all the way through there? So like you get into the weeds a little bit there. I'm never going to ask you to write a sorting algorithm. But I piss people off so much when they say, well, what's big O notation? And I say a stupid way to write out code efficiency. They're like, oh, what do you mean stupid? Like, that's how I learned it. And I'm like, well, I think the better way to write or to test code efficiency is to take a real life data sample and then write your code out and time it, right? Put in, there's something called console.time, and it starts a timer of when the code starts to run, and then put a console.time end at the end of it, and it will tell you exactly how long it took that code to execute. They're like, yeah, but what if the data set changes and it's a different structure? And I'm like, then give me the other data set and I will time it. And if that one is quicker, then that one is more efficient. They're like, oh, heavens, I spent an entire semester studying big O notation. And I'm like, well, who cares? Like, what does efficiency matter? Efficiency matters how long it takes the computer to execute the code, right? So, like, if it is noticeably quicker, then okay, that's how we should be measuring efficiency. We should be measuring efficiency in a real world metric, time, that humans understand, not in some complex formula that takes more time to learn, how to compare these like syntaxes. And it's all about like, oh, this one's exponentially longer and all of that stuff. So anyway, in my entire career, which I would consider myself to be a successful full stack web developer, I never once have actually had to write big O notation. I have certainly had to look at code, like hundreds of lines of code, and say, where isn't this efficient? What is causing this code to slow down? But every single time I've been able to solve that with a timer, as opposed to mathematically figuring out how many nested for loops a big O notation is going to be affected by. So I don't know. That's just a side rant there. But I often tell anyone who asks me about big O notation to shove it, because you don't actually need it. But maybe that's me biased against traditional computer science education. Okay. Let's get back to our code. Any questions that popped up over the break?
Not specifically about the code, but I was trying to put an image in the alert on JavaScript. You can't, apparently. Is
You
that
cannot. No, you cannot. You have to
no?
use just plain text there. And I
Yeah.
think you can't even use HTML in there, which is kind of interesting. But that does bring up a good point. A lot of people are, a lot of developers feel restricted by what they can do with an alert. So you can also do something called a window.confirm, which is like, are you sure you want to delete? And instead of an OK button, they give you a yes or no. And then whatever gets returned by that is a true or false. That can be really helpful. There's also one called window.prompt, where you can pass the parameter of like, what's your name, right? And then the user gets a text box, and when they hit the OK button, whatever they type into the text box is what gets returned. But you have absolutely zero control of the styling of that alert box. And so what a lot of developers will often do is basically build their own alert using a modal, where the modal is like a div that pops up in the center of the screen, and they can't like click out of it, they can't dismiss it, but that gives you a lot more control because it's basically just a div, right? So you can apply whatever CSS you want to it, you can apply whatever background to kind of gray out the screen behind it. You can make it so like the escape button closes it, or they can click on the background and that will close it. So oftentimes an alert is kind of like JavaScript's developers like shortcut to like just throw something up, but it is so limiting that a lot of developers will end up building out their own components, their own divs, their own functionality around a modal, just so that you can have control over it. So yeah, you won't find many websites that use an alert, just because there's not a lot of customization around it. But for a small little, project like this, it makes a lot of sense.
So for an example of a modal is like if you go to a retail store and it's like join our email and you can't like get out of it until you
Yeah,
press
and
the little
some
tiny X or like
Yes, that's exactly it. And some modals are dismissible. And so I think Bootstrap gives you control over that. Um, why does Google not link to Bootstrap 5 as the default? Drives me nuts. So this is an example of a modal. And like I said, this is right off Bootstrap. So if you like the styling of this, this looks certainly a lot nicer than the JavaScript alert that pops up. But you can see there's like a little click here, and this displays, and then this is all just CSS. So you can be like, oh, I don't want it at the top of the screen. I want it to be centered, or I don't want to allow them to have an X button here, or be able to click off of it. So um, there are ways of modifying that here. Like I said, vertically centered. They give you an example of that. They give you an example of like being able to do a popover in the modal, so you can get like, now we're 3 layers of content on the page. You can I don't know, there are different modals that you can toggle between, and then you can go back to the first one. So you can think of it as like a in-page pop-up almost, is what a modal is. And they can be really helpful when you don't want to bring the user to an entirely second page, but you want them to have the context of the page that they are on. So think about it as like an alert, but on steroids and a lot more customizable.
Nice. I put that in my notes.
Any other questions?
So while the console, you can hear the computer screen.
What?
I said while the console, you can't hit the computer screen.
Correct.
So it's so when I guess working with HTML and like JavaScript and stuff, you'll always have like the inspect up pretty much.
Yeah, HTML, it's more important for like the elements tab, right? To be able to like play around with your CSS. And I guess there are some times that the CSS may log into the console. Don't quote me on that because I've been using React for so long, and in that case, it definitely will show up there. But yes, whenever you are developing, and that is a good note in the console, at least in Chrome, every browser is a little different. You can dock the console to a different side. So by default, it shows up over here on the right. I don't know why this triggers me so much, but I think this is the wrong placement of the console. So whenever I'm on your computer, I apologize if I move it down to the bottom. That's just like what feels more right for me. And then the other thing you can do is detach the console so you can actually have it like in a separate window. So when you're working with your two monitors, sometimes it makes sense to like have the website huge and then have your console off on another monitor. So you can detach it if you want. I will say Ryan will be coming in 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Everyone should have Chrome downloaded and installed on their computer. Um, Oh, thank you, Joe. Everyone should have Chrome downloaded because you guys are going to be getting into API calls. And while Elements and Console are not significantly different across browsers, when we get into the network tab will be slightly different. So I think all major browsers do have a network tab and you can dive into it. But you will be it will be harder for you to learn the content because you'll be looking for like where it is in the other browser. So I do recommend everyone have Chrome downloaded and installed, even if you don't make it your default browser, just having it for that API week, because there are important concepts in there. Any other questions? Okay. We are going to dive back in. We have made it so far so that we get a error message if we click on a seat. We've made it so that we can select two different seats. The last major thing that we need, two things we need to accomplish. One, if we click on a seat, it will allow us to deselect that seat. The other thing we need to do is make it so that when we click on movie seats, it says down here, you have two seats selected for a total of $20. So we are going to make this work together. And then I am going to challenge you guys to try and make it so that you can unselect a seat. With that said, let's get this working down here. So the first thing I want to do is make a div for this to show up. So I'm going to head back into my HTML, which apparently we have not worked on at all tonight. And I am going to go outside of my seats container and make a div ID for, I don't know, we'll call it selection status. And nothing will be in there by default. But we do need to keep track of how many seats were selected. This is the notion of a counter or an iterator. Well, not really an iterator. It's more of a counter. The idea here is we could go through and count the number of seats that have a selected status. But that gets really complex, right? Because we need to, again, deal with what movie is selected. We need to deal with the for loop to go over all the rows. We need a for loop to go over all of the columns. And then we need to dive into the object and see how many items are selected. And that just seems like a lot of overkill to just keep track of, hey, you clicked on 2 different seats, right? So what we're going to do is come down after our movie's object. And this is where scope is really important. We can't say number of seats and declare it right in our on click. If we did that in our on click all the way down here, that variable is only going to be remembered inside these curly braces. So if we are trying to keep track of something outside of the actual click event, we need to declare this variable at the global level so that we can access it not only every time the seat is clicked, but we can access it really anywhere that we want. So we're going to go all the way up to our movies object and say, let num selected equal 0. Doesn't matter what we name it, as long as we are consistent. Does matter that we call it a let, because we are going to be changing that value as we click on different seats. And it's important that we start it out as 0, right? Because if we just said let num selected and then we added 1 to num selected, it would be like, add 1 to what? You didn't tell me where to start that variable at. So we started at 0. We then come down and say, when do we want to increment that? We don't want to do it just when a seat is clicked, because if they click on a seat that is occupied, we don't want to add to that number. So we're going to come down into our else statement and say num selected plus plus. Then we want to be careful, because we don't want to just come in here and say document get element by ID and throw that text in there, because there are a lot of different places we can update our HTML. This update HTML is already doing a lot of work on the seats array. We may need to update the text that shows up down here that says you have 2 seats selected, right? So we're actually going to put the logic for the num selected inside the update HTML. So you may be noticing we've got a lot of different code, and now we're scrolling up and down and we're getting, lost in the code. Well, there's a shortcut here. If you hold down the command button on your keyboard and click on update HTML, it will jump you right to the spot that update HTML is defined. So we don't have to scroll up to find it. We can command click on the word update HTML, and it will jump us to that update HTML function. So I'm going to go down to the bottom part of this. After we do all of the logic for the seats HTML, I now need to say, hey, you have 2 seats selected for a total of $20. So I'm going to say, let selected text equal, and I'm going to do a template literal and say you have, do my $ curly braces there, and say num selected right in here. Num selected seats. I save that. I come over here. I click on a seat in the actual code, and I don't see anything. What step did we miss?
Console.log?
No, because I don't want it in my console.
You got to insert it into the inner HTML of that
I
thing.
sure do. I got to say document get element by ID. What ID do I want? I want the ID of selection status. And I can set the inner HTML of that equal to the selected text. And now when I pick a movie, you have 0 seats. And if I click on a seat, it says I have 1 seat. Click on another seat, it says you have 2 seats. It should say you have 2 seats selected. Maybe it's already. And just to prove what inner HTML can do here, this doesn't just have to be text. We can actually throw a style on here that has a class of bold, close out that span tag, and then in our style.css, throw a bold with a text weight of bold to font weight. I know what I'm doing. Font weight of bold. And now our number shows up bolded. And if we click on seats, it will show us that we have those seats selected. And if we click on an unselected or a taken seat, it still gives us our error message and does not increase the number of seats selected. Okay. I'm going to pause there. And I'm going to challenge you guys to think through, if you have not been writing code along tonight, that's totally fine. But kind of think through either in a scratch pad or what JavaScript concepts would it take to make it unselect a seat, because now I'm clicking on the same seats and it's just telling me I've got 8 seats selected. And I'm like, no, I don't. I got 2 of them selected. How would I modify this code, which you need to break down into where am I trying to modify it? What JavaScript concept do I need to do? And then in that concept, how am I going to make it unselect the seat instead of selecting the seat? So again, the objective, how do I modify this code to make it so if I click on a selected seat, it will unselect it? And what else do I need to update other than just that seat selection? So I'm going to start a poll to give you guys a minute to work on that. And let me know where you're at.
Can you put that objective in writing?
I sure can. Well, I sure can if I can find the chat. Oh, here it is. When I click on select, when I click on a seat that is already selected. Let me revise that because apparently I can't write English after I've been writing code. When I click on a seat that is already selected, how do I make it unselect and what variables do I need to update? Half of you have voted in, so give you guys a couple more minutes to work on that. You got it, Desiree. No need for another event loop. We can take advantage of the seat clicked we already have. Go over it together at 8 p.m. So 2 more minutes. Definitely on the right track there, Austin. All right, let's go over this together. So we already have a function attached to the seat clicked, right? So we don't, JavaScript gets weird if you have multiple on-click functions related to the same thing. We could get really fancy in our statement, right, where we generate the span, and we can say, well, if this seat is occupied, let's attach it to a different function. But we're already in our HTML. We're already kind of muddying that up, right, um, with our occupied and our selected classes and all of that information. So I, especially because we've already done the work to get that specific seat out, would personally modify that if statement. Of course, you could do the on click. You could link that on click to a different function if you wanted to. But because we already have a conditional in here, I lean towards staying in our JavaScript as opposed to making an entirely separate function. So what I would do is I would say, well, if the seat is occupied, it's not selected, so we don't need to worry about it. But I don't want this to happen if another thing is true. So I'm going to say else if the seat is selected, then I want you to do something. Otherwise, the seat must not be occupied and it must not be selected. So we have to do all of this stuff in here. So I'm going to say if the seat is selected, I need to do 2 things. I need to set the seat selected to false. I need to decrement, well, we'll get to that in a second, and I need to update our HTML based off of whatever movie is selected. So I come down here, I refresh, I grab my movie, I pick a seat, I click on that seat again, and now it does deselect the blue, but down here I still have, you have 1 seat selected. Okay, well, that's not ideal. I also, just like I num selected plus plus, I also now need to num selected minus minus. But look at what happens here. Because I have this after the update HTML function, when I run this and select a seat and deselect the seat, now I still have one seat selected. And if I select another seat, now it kind of catches back up and is accurate. Well, what's happening there? This update HTML runs the entire function, which updates all the HTML. And then I'm like, oh, by the way, now that you're done updating all the HTML, take one off num selected. So whenever we're using counters, it's very important to see when are we incrementing that counter. Are we incrementing or decrementing that counter at the beginning of a loop, at the end of a loop, somewhere in the middle of it? Because this update HTML is doing all the HTML updates, and then after all the HTML is done updating, it is now subtracting 1 from it. So we do want to move that up so the HTML does not get updated until we take 1 off the num selected. And again, this num selected minus minus is the same thing as saying num selected equals num selected minus 1. That's the same exact thing, just a little shorthand in our JavaScript. So we save that, we come over here, we pick a movie, we pick 2 of our seats, we say, just kidding, I don't want that seat anymore, and now it subtracts 1. Get a little fancy here. This is not correct grammar, right? You have 1 seats selected. Well, I go to movies all the time by myself. Don't judge me. I want to make it so that that S only shows up if there's more than 1 seat selected. So, and go find where that text is. That is up in our updated update HTML. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to use my template literal. I'm going to say my $ curly brace, and I'm going to say, hey, if num selected is greater than 1, what do I want to happen? I want an S to show up. But if it is not greater than 1, I want nothing to show up. So I save, I come over here, I pick this. It says you have 0 seat selected. Okay, well, we got to fix that too. But if we click on 1, we have 1 seat selected. If I click on another one, it says you have 2 seats selected. So let's modify that if statement because I wasn't thinking. If num selected is exactly equal to num selected is not equal to 1, show an S, otherwise don't show anything. So I come in here, I pick my movie. You have 1 seat selected, you have 2 seats selected, and if I refresh everything, it shows me that information. Okay. Let's comment all of this out. And then if there is time left, I will leave it open for you guys to decide what we want to add to this. So we left off at number 30 something. Very specific, I know. 31. Is there 32? No, we left off at 31. So we're going to go down to 31. Command F is your friend in your code. If you're ever trying to jump to a specific spot, you can always hit Command F and jump right there. And then later on in the cohort, we'll get into find and replace, which is also really powerful. Okay, so we did the work. For context, we're in the seat clicked. We got the selected movie. We got the data row index from the for loop that generated out all of these individual spans. We went into the data and got the specific seat that we cared about. Now we need to dive into that a little bit more. So we're going to say 32. Check to see if the seat data from number 31 has an occupied key with a value of true. 33. If it does, log out, alert the user they can't take this seat and ignore the rest of the if statement. If the seat isn't occupied, check to see if it's already selected. If it is, set selected to false, subtract 1 from the counter of selected seats, and update the HTML. Yes, I use Oxford commas. Okay. 36. The seat isn't selected or occupied, so we must assume they are trying to select the seat. Set it equal to selected, log out the seat so we can confirm the data change, update the counter, then update the HTML based off the selected movie that gets sent in as an argument to the functions parameter. So 35 and 36 are both going to jump us into update HTML. So we'll just start that as 37, but just know sometimes only 33 will run, sometimes only 34 and 35 will run, and sometimes only 36 will run. And if at any point I'm going through this and you I don't get what that sentence means, or you want some clarification, feel free to interrupt me. I don't want you to think that I need to go on a tangent to document all of this out.
Yeah,
Okay, so, yeah.
sorry, Max, I mean to interrupt, but I'm trying to really understand like parameters.
Yep.
I'm trying to like relate it to I don't know, like a real world type of thing. Do I think of it as like the function is like a table and the parameter are like chairs? Is that a good comparison or
No, so think about it more as oh, I'm trying to think of a good analogy and I'm blanking. So think about it like this, right? We can make a function that says square, right? And in order to know how to square a number, how do you square a number? You times that number by itself, right? So you say return num1 times num1. Okay, well, if I say, hey, go square a number, what's the first thing that you're going to ask me?
how?
Okay, and I tell you, you multiply the number by itself. What's the second thing you ask me?
What number?
What number? That's what I was going for, right? And so this function is like, I don't know how to square a number unless you tell me what the number is. Well, it does actually know how to square a number because we just told it times it by itself. But if we just say console.log square, it's going to say not a number.
Oh,
It's
because
like,
you didn't put anything in the inside the parentheses to give
correct.
data.
What we put in here is an argument. That argument gets sent into this parameter, which then gets used here and here as a variable. So if we say square 5, oops, it's going to say 25, right? 25, 5 times 5 is 25. That's how 5 to the second exponent is 25. Why do we need that? Why wouldn't we just say 5 times 5? Well, we could, but we may have more advanced stuff going on here, right? So we may be subtracting 32 and multiplying by 9/5 or whatever the equation is, right? Or we may be doing a bunch of different things, like update HTML is doing 2 for loops and it's based off of all this data. What is that data based off of? Well, it's based off of what movie is selected. And the way that we get the selected movie may be through the on change of, hey, you just changed the select. What did you change it to? Or it may be when we click on a seat, we don't know what movie was selected. So we need to reach back into the HTML, go to that select, get the selected movie, and then send that into the update HTML. So basically, what we did in the update HTML is we said, hey, the movie that gets selected is going to change. So we're going to give you some parameter and say, hey, we're going to send that data in via an argument. That argument comes into the parameter. The parameter goes, oh, I was expecting what movie got selected. And so because of that, I know what to use. Okay, I like that ChatGPT answer. So the ChatGPT answer is, think about it as a factory is the function, right? Where the parameters that come in are the raw materials. The assembly process is what happens in the function, and then whatever gets returned from the function is the finished product, right? So if we're making M&Ms, right? Well, we don't need to put in chocolate into the function because chocolate is used in every M&M that we make. So we get access to that. That's no problem. But we need to know if we're putting in red dye number 5 or yellow 40 or whatever it is. That's going to come in as a parameter. So when we call the function, we're going to say yellow. That comes in as the parameter. The function now goes, oh, you're making a yellow M&M. I know how to do that. I know how to make all M&Ms, but because you told me yellow, I know that. Then it's going to still make the candy coating. It's still going to, print the M on it. It's still going to make sure there's chocolate inside of it. And then what comes out is going to be the yellow M&M. Now I'm going to get sued for copyright infringement. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you, Joe, for that assist. That was a very good example of ChatGPT coming in handy for your learning.
Yeah, that definitely make a lot of sense. Thanks.
Okay, any questions so far? Okay, this is also why we don't comment code until the end of the night. I know it's a lot to ingest, but oftentimes when we're writing code, we need to refactor it, right? So we had already done all of this work in this update HTML, right? And so if we go to this update HTML, it turns out we actually already have all of this documented. So this is where it gets tricky, right? Where you go through and you're like, should we renumber everything? Because now we're calling update HTML not only when the movie dropdown changes, which is when we did 20 through 21, 22, all of those, but we're also doing it when we select a seat. So now we need to dive in, leaving off at 36, we need to dive into update HTML and say 37. This function not only gets called when we select a movie from the dropdown, it also gets, and we're going to say called here. When you call a function, it just means we're going to ask this function to run. It also gets called when we click on a seat. So everything happens the same here until we get down to 38. Now, based off the data based off of the object, the seat object, I should say, we add a class of selected, which makes the seat display blue. And then finally, we also have said number 39 based off of the number of selected seats, generate a string that shows the number of selected seats and the singular verse plural. I don't really love the way this is written, so I'm going to flip this. I'm going to say if the number of seats is equal to 1, don't show anything. Otherwise, show the S for the seats. That may be a little bit of a clearer way of writing that, as opposed to saying not equal, because we don't really, our brain doesn't think in negatives. So normally it's better to think about that as if it's equal to this, do this thing. Otherwise, do this other thing. And then number 40, use the text from number 39 to make it show up in the HTML. And just like that, we have made our first movie theater seats app. Just make sure I didn't miss a solid section of code. Nope, we're good to go. I'm going to pause there, take a couple minutes, review this code, see if you have any questions. If you do, you can ask them now. We're going to give you 2 minutes to review the code until 8:20. And then if there are no questions about the existing code, you can ask me how I would go about adding other features.
Sorry, I was reading through the code again. Can you repeat what you just said?
Yeah, spend the next minute reviewing the code, seeing if you have questions about any section of it. And if you do not, think of things that you would like to see me add to this in the next 10 minutes, and I will give an attempt at doing so.
Thank you. I'll try to come up with something.
Well, I do have a question. It's where you added you have, I guess is where we have the selected thing on yours where it tells you how many seats you selected.
Yep.
I can't get that to work on mine.
Go ahead, share screen. Let's take a look.
Yeah. Let me just move my stuff over to one screen.
Of course. Okay, I'm going to request remote. Thank you for having your laptop plugged in on a low battery, because that is a trigger point for me. Okay, we are going to see, first thing, we start all the way up at the top. We do have num selected started at 0, so that means we can add to it, and it's a let, which means we can change it. Then on our seat clicked, we do our num selected -1 if it is already selected, or we add 1 to it. So that's all good. That means that when we go into our update HTML, we can go down to the selected text. We have num selected. We have the S. We do all of that. Take the selected text and put it inside the selection status. So my guess would be that the index.html has a selected status, not a selection status.
Oh, okay.
Give that a try, see if that fixes it.
All right. We got too many things open here. Okay, there you go. Yep, that was it.
Anyone else before I get on to Joe's question? Questions about a line of code, questions about a numbered comment, questions about a concept, questions about any concept that we use that you still don't understand why we used it or what that concept is for. So Austin, good question. And it's easier to answer than Joe's, so that's why I'm picking yours first. Um, the what if a theater has fewer or more seats in it? Well, that's going to be dependent on the movie itself, right? So we need to adjust that in here. Let's say that every movie theater, because the concept is the same for the number of columns as well. Where this answer gets a little bit more complex is if you're like, well, what about handicap seats? Or what if I need to assign a theater number? Or what if the first row has fewer seats because, it's so close? Or what if there's an exit door that blocks something? Or what about aisles in between, right? Well, eventually you get to the point where you're like, I need to hard code that information. I need to say that this theater has a grid and this seat is missing because it's a handicap seat or because there's an aisle there or whatever it is, right? So you do get to the point where you have to hard code some of that information in the seats array. But and that's how it would be done in production. But what if we're like, oh, you know what? Rugrats is the best movie of all time. So that theater has I don't know, 20 rows in it. Planet of the Apes has 15 rows in it. Citizen Kane has 10 rows in it, and The Godfather only has 2 rows in it. Well, we can add that in. Oh, thank you. So we can add those rows in as just another key of information. And then we can come down here and say, hey, instead of in our for loop, where we run our for loop based off of whether it's less than 8, instead, what we can do is say, hey, look at the movie data and the number of rows that's associated with that. And the kind of cool thing here is because we have based everything else based off of a for loop that is all dynamic, believe it or not, that's all we need to do to pick the Rugrats and see that we've got all of those rows. But if we pick the Godfather, we only get 2 rows. So that is kind of like the middle answer, right? The super complex answer is, well, at a certain point, we need to rethink our multi-dimensional array and kind of hard code it for all the different kinds of seats. We could also have a separate object that's called theaters or theater seats and start getting fancy as, oh, the Rugrats is showing in the big theater, so we use this seat arrangement, right? But Godfather is in theater 2, so that's a smaller setup. The middle answer for complexity is, well, we can store that in that particular object. And then what we would break though is if all of a sudden we forgot and we're like, oh, the Godfather doesn't have any rows. Well, now when we get into the Godfather, it's like, where are the seats? I don't know how many rows are in that theater, so I'm not going to put any seats in there. So you do want to be consistent on your data. And the same problem would happen is if you said row and it's like, well, I'm looking for rows. I don't know what row is. So you need to be consistent there. And then the really short answer to all of that is, well, in that for loop, instead of basing it off movie data.rows, we could throw any number in here if we wanted that every theater to have 15 rows. So now no matter what we pick, we always get that 15 rows in here. And the same goes for columns, right? So we could have like 300 columns of seats. And believe it or not, that would actually still work and give us, obviously they don't fit all on the screen, but we could have an absurd number of seats in one movie theater. I don't know if you're in like the Sphere in Las Vegas or something, you could get really fancy, or, you know, a sports stadium or something like that. You can have a ridiculous number of else if statements. I don't know what the ridiculousness threshold is there.
1,000.
I- at a certain point, you want to start breaking up your if statements. You can also get into a level, you can have an infinite number of nested loops or if statements, or really any level blocks of code. The biggest function, or the biggest object I've ever worked with, has had about 18 layers of nested data. Um, that I work with that pretty common at work. Is that ridiculous? Probably leaning on that scale, but every object and every key is very properly named. So when you get that far nested down, it becomes easier. The other concept you can use is saying like, hey, this one function has 100 lines of code in it, and it's getting really hard to keep track of what this function is doing. So instead of making the M&Ms where I'm melting the chocolate and I'm running a for loop over it to figure out what color to use, and I'm like doing all of this work, at a certain point it makes sense to make one main function that calls other functions inside of it. And that can be a really helpful way of breaking up your blocks of code so you don't get so far nested in, right? It makes it a little bit easier to say, oh, an M&M is going to do this, this, and this, and then inside those three functions, I'm going to do the actual work. So that can be a way to simplify your code there. 3 else ifs is certainly not enough to get crazy. I would say that's probably more on the order of like 10 to 15 is when you want to start thinking about, is there a way for me to simplify this, to break up these else if statements. I have a couple times in my career written code that basically generated if statements that had like 200 or 300 cases in them. But you definitely want to think about like, hey, if I can't keep this in my head, even if the computer can, I can't, and so it's going to be a much harder thing to uh, understand for future developers. Joe, if you are curious about how I made the checkout button work, if you head over to my movies .maxmathee.ws, you can take a look. If you hit view page source, you will see this is very similar to how our HTML started out. If you click into the script.js, you will see what I have done in previous cohorts to make this work. You will see that there is work in here for the checkout function. The checkout function is linked to this checkout button right here. And then what I do is I still go into my movie dropdown to get the value. I get out the specific movie data. I use our for loop for the rows and columns. And what I go through here is go through all of the seats. And if that column is selected, then I set selected to false and occupied to true. And then I call my updated seats, which is using all of the selected movie data. And then finally, I send up an alert that basically says, like, you would normally enter your credit card information here.
Just a housekeeping question. I think we've seen const movie equals movie selected movie, or that's movie title. Okay. I think there was a selected movie in a couple places though.
Yeah,
Wouldn't it
so
be
I
best
did
practice to make that global?
I did kind of solve that here. Kind of. You want to be careful because you don't want to store the selected movie globally because that value will change. So you could solve that two ways. In this code, I store my movie dropdown globally. And then that way, whenever I want the value out of it, I can just do a dot value, and the document object model will update this variable, the value of that variable, so that I can always get the active thing. The other way of doing that is you could say on change here, grab the selected movie and then store selected movie as a global variable. And once that's global, because you're updating it on every change, selected movie is something that you can rely on being up to date. So yes, housekeeping wise, we want to avoid document.get anything as much as we can. We want to, because accessing the document object model is expensive, big O my ass. But it is a larger big O notation. And so because of that, using global variables is certainly preferred. I actually did get knocked off on a technical interview for a job once because I was accessing the document object model too frequently. And they knocked my code off for that. And then I also submitted code that proved to them that it literally was nanoseconds slower and could not be measured by the computer of how much slower it was. And they said, well, that's that's not best practice, because if you're on a huge site, it would take significantly longer to run. And then I promptly told them that I did not want to work at their company.
Yeah, I was taught in high school, not like we never went over big O notation, but it was best practice to try to make it as efficient as possible. I think we're employing it here as dry. But
yes, dry is a good concept. The only thing that you need to be careful of on efficiency is writing your code so it's so
so it's
efficient
readable.
that you can't read, that developers can't read it anymore, right? And that not only goes for other developers, but you, when you're reviewing your code 6 months later and then being like, who the fuck wrote this? And then the answer is you. And with Git, there's actually a command called git blame. I used it at work today because I was working in a code base I had never worked on before. And I was like pair programming with another developer to get through it. And I'm like, all right, well, this line of code is commented out. I wonder who did that. And so in I don't know if you can do it in VS Code, but in WebStorm, which is the text editor I use, you can like right click on the line of code and hit git blame, and it will show you a column of all the last times, the dates, and who modified it last. And it was him. And so it was like I was able to actually click into that specific commit and see what commit message he wrote. And I'm like, well, you disabled this March 4th of 2023. Let's see what the commit was of why you disabled it. So that can be helpful.
Is
And
that track?
so you guys are welcome to head out here, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. Go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
Does git blame track the contents, or does it go by the exact line? So if I push everything around with white space, is it tracking that update, or is it tracking the content?
Git blame is Git itself is pretty good about not being assigned to a static line number. So like Git tracks every change. So even if you're, let's say you like make a change to that line and then someone down the road adds 10 lines of code to it, it will still associate the lines of code, that specific line of code.
You have to connect Git to it. I have WebStorm. I got everything, all of JetBrains stuff installed last night.
It does need to be in an initialized Git repo in order for the Git menu to show up. And unfortunately, I don't have access on this user account on my computer. Oh, I don't even have access to WebStorm. That's cool. For security reasons, I don't have access to the code with like a Git repo set up that I can show you.
Is it the same thing as just opening, like setting the default, or
Not
what my
quite.
desired text editor is?
So if I open this and pop open like day 2, did that open on another monitor?
Yes, it did.
So I can do if I open the terminal, I can git init this, which will make an empty Git repo. And then I can git add all the files. and then I can git commit with a message of first commit. And then if I right click on this and annotate with git blame, it will say this was all modified today by you.
Oh, okay. So it's all right. So it tracks by each commit.
Yeah,
I
and so you
gotcha.
can see now if I like add some comment and git add everything and git commit with a message of second commit. Now if I go back into my annotate, both are still going to say today, but if I click on this one, you'll see that it highlights the second commit and shows me that commit message. And then you could even double click on it and see the diff of what I added.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I like it. It's slightly different getting used to, but for the most part, it's pretty familiar.
Yeah, they've done a much better job now of not overwhelming you. It used to be that like, and I guess this is still true a little bit more in Java than JavaScript, where like there's a lot more to set up and getting it to run your file and all of that stuff. But I think they've done a good job of kind of hiding away some of the features so it's less intimidating when you get started.
Yeah. Well, time to go do intro to programming homework.
Well, have fun. I'll see you guys.
Bye.